This is Studio 809.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. I'm your host, Hiking Bob Falcone. You can check me out on my website at hikingbob.com, which has links to my social media, my columns at the Colorado Springs Independent, my photography website, and all the other podcasts I've done. And while I have you, I'm conducting a survey to get a feel for what you guys think of the podcast and maybe what direction it should go in. So check the show notes for a link to that survey. It'll be up for about another week. And thanks to everybody who's already participated in the survey. Appreciate all the responses and look forward to hearing from the rest of you. Today, my special guest is, and you've seen him on TV, he's been around Colorado Springs for many, many years. He is the Fox 21 Chief Meteorologist, Matt Meister. Hey, Matt.
Good to be here, Bob. I have a question before we jump in today.
Yes, sir.
If you're getting feedback on your podcasts, it means you've been doing this for a long time.
Over 8 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's like you were doing podcasts before podcasts were a thing.
I think I might have had Marconi on my podcast.
Okay.
I didn't go back that far.
Nice. That's impressive. That is impressive.
I told Marconi his radio thing was out. We were going to go with podcasting.
There you go. Nice.
Yeah, I've been doing it for a while. And I always appreciate everybody who's been there for the since the beginning. A lot of people have. I find it out on the survey. Quite a few people have listened to it from the beginning, which is...
Well, kudos to you for carving out your niche.
Yeah.
In Colorado and what you do, and you've got a name and you give good information, so thanks for doing what you do.
Well, I appreciate that, Matt.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. And I have you here today because you have a lot of great information, and
well, it depends on the day.
There's, I could tell the old joke about, the meteorologist could be wrong half the time and still be pretty successful.
Yeah. Well, I came to Colorado to play baseball in college, where if you're successful 3 times out of 10, you're so good they put you in the Hall of Fame.
You're great, yeah.
When I figured out I couldn't do that for a living, I was like, well, what else has low expectations? No, weatherman. So, here we are.
Yeah, to up it from a third of the time to half the time.
Right.
But,
Exactly.
You've been on the podcast once before, and it's been a little while.
Yep.
And we kind of talked about this weather forecasting in Colorado Springs, in Colorado in general, is challenging. Oh, yeah. I imagine. Yeah. We're sitting here in Colorado Springs. The plains are off to the east, and 14,000-foot peaks are off to the west.
And not very far away.
No, they run right into each other. We're literally where they all run into each other. How does that? I mean. I'm thinking, we have weather radar and things like that, but how many things are like hiding behind some 14,000-foot peak that you don't see until they pop up and like, holy crap, there's a storm coming or something?
I think that's one of the challenges. We're in one of the spots in the country where storms tend to intensify as they move from the mountains out onto the plains. And when they do that right on top of you, 30, 40 miles makes a huge difference to what you experience out the front door. And that's not necessarily a mathematically, bad calculation or anything, especially when you're looking on a multi-state or a continental scale. But, to your neighborhood and your road, it makes a huge difference.
Sure.
And so that makes it fun. I mean, people do ask me when I go to national weather conferences and that sort of thing, like, why are you still there doing that? Why would you do that to yourself? And then the other challenge is there are micro-scale things, microclimates in the mountains that, frankly, I don't know. So people that live up certain draws and that sort of thing, they know that when the wind is out of a certain direction, they get X amount more or percent more or less than we tend to say here on TV. And I'm like, if you figured that out for your little spot on this earth, go with it because we don't know.
Right.
So,
and you can't, and I imagine you just can't see it. I mean, there's some of those draws, they're thousands of feet down below the next mountain, and it's got to be hard to see it.
Yeah, and winds pushing up, the side of a ridge, and radar doesn't get back there. Right. Sometimes we don't hear what's happened, so I can't really put that into my memory bank, And so the more people can report to us, especially in the winter, about how much snow they do or don't have, it helps me build this memory bank or this climatology in my head, and we keep records of that stuff here in the Fox 21 Weather Center that help us the next time a similar sort of looking storm comes through.
And even in town here, I live up by UCCS, so I live up on a hill, and I could be getting snow at my house,
Yeah.
and then I drive a mile down to Fillmore Street,
Right.
and there's no snow.
Especially early or late in the season when that freezing level's kind of right on top of us. I mean, 100 feet can make a huge difference.
Right.
And we don't have time to talk about all of that on TV in particular. I mean, the web and social media allows us to dive into that a little bit more. But, man, it sure makes it fun, as I like to say in air quotes.
I imagine you probably hear from people like up in Rock Rimmon, for example. Hey, I got snow. You didn't tell me there's going to be snow coming. Well, you're down here almost to the airport, and you're not seeing snow down here.
Right. Well, I better not get that part wrong, because that's where I live. So I can look at my Ring camera in the driveway. But the point is well taken.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, ground truth is always very helpful to us because, sometimes the rain to snow changeover will happen quicker than we think. And then that usually means that, the elevation is a little bit lower than we thought it might have been. And so it keeps us on our toes and keeps us humble for sure.
And you mentioned, 30 or 40 miles, where we're at right up against Pikes Peak here, 14,000-foot peak, and then the plains. Yeah. A lot of times in the summer, you'll be talking about the thunderstorms, and they're rolling in from the west, coming over Pikes Peak, and it almost seems like they go right past us. But then you get out, Calhoun and further out towards Kansas, and they're getting hammered with ping pong ball size hail.
Right.
We're all sitting there going, looks pretty good here.
Right.
But it's just, I guess it just keeps blowing over us till it finally drops down.
Well, again, we're in this weird spot right on the interface of the mountains and the plains where there's this built-in instability over the mountains every day. And as those thunderstorms go up, the places in the mountains are pretty close to the base of the storm, so they'll get rain. Yeah. But as those storms move right over the city, raindrops have farther to fall through, and the air is pretty dry. Right. And so a lot of it will evaporate. And so that's why we're like, oh, that wasn't all that exciting. But then it gets east, and there's more low-level moisture 30 minutes, an hour east of us. And so the storms then, raindrops are falling into a more moist air mass below the cloud base. And so they're in business, and the storms are often intensifying then. Right. So, yeah, we live in this really, really weird and complicated spot.
So here we're seeing Berga, and there they're seeing floods.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to watch that. I've been here for more than 30 years. You've been here about 20 some odd years.
Yeah, 25, yeah.
Yeah, so, we've been here almost the same amount of time, and the weather is just been constantly amazed me. And I've got a little weather station at my house, and I've got cameras, so I'll be away someplace, and one of them I can actually steer it and move it around. I'll be like, boy, it looks like it's getting, I'll swing the thing around and look at where the snow's coming in and stuff.
Well, if someone's really interested in the small scale, variability that is real and really happens out there, if you haven't been to this site called Weather Underground, there's lots of private weather stations that are fed into that website from different makers and that sort of thing. But when there's a storm moving through, again, I think especially, if we're talking winter weather, early and late in the season, to pull up the temperatures across really small distances in the city or neighborhoods, those are real. I mean, where I'm at in Rock Rimmon, somebody up on one of the hillsides versus where I am on Dry Creek, there can be 15-degree differences in the mornings when inversions are really, really shallow. And so it's not like, oh, that person has a crummy weather station and that one has a good one. It's real stuff. So I always think it's funny when, on TV we like to say, oh, the temperature in Colorado Springs is X. But it's not. Sometimes in January, sometimes if there's real shallow Arctic air masses, there can be 30-degree differences across town. And so it's, like I said, keeps us on our toes.
Well, if it was easy, you'd be a weather guy in San Diego.
Right, I'd be
75 and sunny all the time, or Honolulu or something like that. Yeah. And I don't want to take anything away from the meteorologist there, but that's a whole lot easier of a job than doing it out here. Right. I can't imagine trying to do this in Aspen or something like that. It's probably even crazier.
Oh yeah, nuts.
Yeah, it's got to be completely nuts. We're coming up in the winter, and it seems like winter just bam. We were enjoying warm weather, and all of a sudden, oh, wait a minute, we forgot this is supposed to be winter, and somebody opened up the freezer doors.
Right. Usually how it goes, right?
Yeah, it's been nuts. It's been cold. When this airs tomorrow, it's going to be another cold day. Yeah, and it was a cold day yesterday. And in the middle here, we're sitting there, it's about 50 degrees. Nice today, It's just weird. So we always hear about every winter, La Nina or El Nino.
Yeah.
What is the difference between the two? And then my second question is, which one are we in this year?
Yeah, good question. So it's called ENSO. It's El Nino in the Southern Oscillation, which is actually this sort of back and forth that happens with sea surface temperatures off the west coast of South America, so kind of west of Peru and Chile, and right on the equator. And those temperatures go from a warm phase when they are above average, which is what we call an El Nino, and then a phase when they are colder than average, which is what we call a La Nina. And it's one of about a dozen circulations across the globe that are these sort of ocean atmosphere kind of teleconnections or responses, these mini systems, if you will, that tend to drive the mean position of the jet stream or the average position of the jet stream. And that's really important because the storms are sort of on the jet stream. And so if over the course of a season, 4 to 5 months or something like that, if you can average where the jet stream is going to be, those will tend to be the stormier areas. And so they're important for us because when it's in its warmer phase, or the El Nino, the jet stream tends to be farther south in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of the United States. And so the jet stream, again, average position over the winter, tends to come from California and Arizona kind of into Colorado in southwest flow. And so we're closer to the storm track, and so we tend to be more active, and the storms tend to have more moisture. Well, this year we are in a La Nina, which is the opposite of that. So in the colder phase of those ocean temperatures on the equator off the coast of South America. And in that, when we're in that phase, the jet stream tends to kind of be coming into the Pacific Northwest and then up across the U.S.-Canada border, and then it tends to kind of dive to the southeast toward the Ohio Valley. And so we tend to be under a ridge more often than not during the winter with the storm track up to our north. Now, it is not the only teleconnection that drives our weather, and that's one of the things that we're working on and learning is how do all of these things fit on top of each other? And for different parts of the country or even different parts of Colorado, which is the biggest driver? But we've learned, in particular in winter, that El Nino and La Nina, have a little bit more of a play, let's say, than the other ones. So if you look at the forecast, and this, gets out of my area of expertise, but if you look at some of the long-term seasonal forecasters, they say it's more likely than not that over the course of 4 or 5 months of winter, that Colorado's probably going to be below average on precipitation, especially the farther south you go. How much above or below? Do we have that skill yet? Not necessarily. But I always like to point out to people, it's dangerous when you try to forecast over the course of a season, because the way that weather works on a short-term, day or two basis, if you get the right storm one time, you can get a lot of your seasonal moisture from one storm, and so that can kind of skew it when you end up looking at the numbers kind of after the fact. So it's like anything in weather, Bob, it's not cut and dry.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is you're trying to predict something that something completely out of your control is going to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So a La Nina, drier than normal.
Mm-hmm.
How about
especially the southern third of the state,
right,
let's say. And usually in those situations, warm. If you're dry, you tend to have less cloud cover and that sort of thing. So you tend to be warmer than average, and especially if we're sitting under that ridge that I talked about.
Right.
And so, odds are we get a mild and dry winter. But I've seen in La Ninas, like January sometimes can have a couple intrusions of some really cold air, because that jet stream that's off to our northeast, cold fronts are riding that thing, and it'll grab really cold air from Canada or sometimes the Arctic and just shove that south along the eastern slopes of the Rockies.
Right.
And so that, the temperature thing, while it probably averages out above average, we might get a couple really cold stretches in late December, January, early February.
None of this means we're not going to have a winter. Obviously, it's going to be cold. We're going to see snow. It's going to be all the stuff that we expect. It's just, maybe we're not going to be below zero a lot, or maybe we're not going to get the frequent snowstorms, but we're still going to see all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. In fact, there is some indication that as we get into kind of the back part of winter and we move past February, that we might tend to be a little more active in March and April, which is, especially here in southern Colorado, east of the mountains, when we tend to, get some of our wetter, more significant type storms. So we'll see if that works out or not. But it's sort of looked that way for the last 2 or 3 months. So, maybe back half of December, January, and February might be pretty quiet. And then, because we've done okay here on the front end as we've jumped into winter, as you've said. And the rest of this week kind of looks a little bit stormy. And then, maybe March and April hold some promise.
And they tend to be, if my memory serves me, tend to be the wetter months, the more snowier months, and I don't know about the colder months. I think January tends to be pretty darn chilly.
Right, just because the sun angle's lowest and all of that. But if you said, hey, here are the months that you get snow, and you called that winter, even though it's, turns into spring, March and April are some of our snowier months.
And they tend to be that wet snow,
exactly.
That heavy, wet stuff. I mean, we always talk about how dry the snow is, and I try to tell people back east, it's very dry. You don't even, you could be out hiking it and you don't even really get wet. I mean, it's
that champagne powder that the ski resorts love.
It is, and they love it. But then again, we get into March and April, and it's just like this snowstorm to get east of the Mississippi, where it's very wet and very heavy.
Right, of course. The cement of the Midwest and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I guess that's probably actually pretty good climate or for our vegetation and stuff, because that heavy wet stuff just lays in there, and with that dry stuff, I mean, I do my driveway with a snowblower. With a leaf blower because it's just so dry.
Yeah, especially in those colder months. I mean, December and January is usually real powdery snow, even here in Colorado Springs, and that's also the kind of snow that as soon as the sun comes out, it's gone. Yeah. If sunlight hits your driveway or your sidewalk, because there's not much water in it.
The smartest thing I did when I bought my house was get a south-facing driveway. I almost never have to shovel it.
Don't rub it in, man. Mine faces north.
Oh, yuck. Yeah, you're in the shade. I got that from having lived in South Dakota when I was in the Air Force, and I'm looking at all these houses. Well, why do all these houses face south? And then first winter there, it's like, I get it now.
Yep. It's a magical thing.
Yeah, they all face south, and they get that natural heating and natural clearing of the snow off the driveway.
Difference.
I rarely ever have to shovel my
I look at my neighbor's driveway across the street, and his face is south, and I'm out there working, and he's just taking the dog for a walk because he knows in an hour it's gone.
In the past, and going back to how long, I've lived here for a bit, it used to be that there would be like a week in January where the temperature, you're lucky if the temperature got above zero. Mm-hmm. It would be just cold. Mm-hmm. It'd be gray and cold. It was like, are we living in Minneapolis or where were we at right now? Not nice and colorful and sunshiny Colorado. We don't see below zero temperatures here very much anymore in Colorado. Yeah. Colorado Springs. I mean, up in the mountains, obviously, they see them far more often. But it used to be like there'd be a week in January when it was just, and I hated that when I was on the fire department because I'd have to go to work and that stuff, and it was like that was miserable work to be. And if there was a fire and we're spraying water and it's 5 below zero, there's few things more in life more miserable than that. You endured it. We don't see that as much anymore. And I know that climate change is a thing that tends to be, I don't know, for some people seem to be controversial, but is that climate change? Is that why we're not seeing that?
Well,
is there any other reason for it?
If you just look at the data, our averages have certainly warmed up over the last 30 or 40 years here along the Front Range in Colorado. But, I mean, the climate since the Earth has been around it's not a steady state. Right. It's always changing.
It's cyclic.
Right. Yeah, exactly. One of the things that kind of drives the temperatures around here is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which over the last 25 years has been in a warm phase. And so over the next 25 years, we're likely going into the colder phase of that, and we may see temperatures start kind of going in the other direction. But again, all of those different, dozen or so teleconnections, how they play together, that's new science. Right. And we don't know. And people are going back into the climate record and trying to figure that out. But some of it, we need some sort of real-time analysis over multiple decades. And when you try to look at how the Earth's climate changes over the course of a human lifetime, man, we're here for a second, Bob. Yeah. Like things take longer than we are around as individuals. And so, it's kind of hard to put all of that into perspective, really. But sure, I mean, you cannot look at the data and say that, especially here in Colorado, that over the last 4 decades, let's say, that, I mean, winters are warmer than they used to be. There's no doubt about that if you just look at the data we've experienced.
Except the one thing I've noticed is no matter how warm it is in October, Halloween is always cold and miserable.
Well,
you could almost bank on it.
Right. Well, and people say that, and people say it snows on every Halloween. It doesn't.
That it doesn't.
Right.
But it's cold.
It doesn't. But what's interesting about human psychology is we tend to remember, a decade down the road, the one that it did.
Right.
And that's what sticks with us. And then especially if you're a kid, right? And so if it snows, let's say 3 of the Halloweens from when you start trick-or-treating until you're 16 or 17 or 18, like those are the ones you're going to remember, right? Of how miserable it was. Or it was really pretty, and so that sticks in your memory. Or, man, you had this awesome costume, but you had to cover it up, and you were trouncing through the snow. So there are things like that where psychology does play a role in what we perceive weather having been like in the past.
And that's why we have all these records. And
right, we got to keep them. Yep.
Now, we're talking about weather, and you're talking about how things have changed over the last 4 decades. But record keeping for weather goes back 150 years,
right? Which isn't that long either.
It's we're taking, which sounds like a long time, 150 years, but in the grand scheme of things, it's nothing. So if we're talking about trying to track weather over 4 decades, but we only go back 150 years, we're really not basing it on a whole lot of old data.
Right. And so there are things that we can use to try to get a record of the climate, things like ice cores in cold parts of the world where the snow stays, tree rings, right? Like trees will grow more in a year where there's more water versus when there's not. So we can see dry periods and wet periods if we use tree rings. And so you're trying to go back using forensic meteorology to try to build this climate picture, which, it's not going to be perfect, but it'll give you an idea of what may have happened. And so, I mean, it's weird to think that, this part of Colorado where we are in used to be under the ocean.
Right.
Like that, not 150 years ago by any stretch, but obviously the climate's been changing if we were under the ocean.
That's how Garden of the Gods got to be what it is.
Right, exactly.
It's exactly where it's from.
Yeah.
I when I'm out in the forest and I'm hiking and I'm looking at, I believe it's the fir trees, and I point out, as you look at the tree trunk, the distance between each row of branches.
Okay.
And that is a year's growth. And this is what it was explained to me, that the bigger that gap is, the more moisture there was that year. So the tree grew. So you look at some trees, and we had a really serious drought just not too many years ago. Right. And there was like an inch. Yeah. And then you look at the wet years, and there's like 6 inches or 8 inches.
Isn't that crazy?
And that's all I need to do to look. And then you look at the end of the branches, and you see the needles, and then the light green ones.
Yeah, the new growth. Yeah.
That is the longer that lighter green is, the new growth, which over the course of the year turns the same color.
Right.
That again is I just look at those things, the distance between the branches and the length of the branches and how much light green needles there are at the end of it. Right. Tells me a lot about what the weather was like in that specific area.
Yeah.
That's super hyper local. That's what happened in that 300 feet of trail that I was on. That maybe is on the north side, north facing, so the snow laid there longer. Right. And on the other side of that hill, it looks entirely different.
Right. And in those years that the trees are growing, I mean, the root system is growing too to make itself more healthy for those lean years, right? So, anything that's living is doing what it can when nutrients or water is available to be strong for when it's not.
Yeah. It's interesting just to pay attention to those little things. And when I take somebody out for a hike, I show them these things and talk about moisture and stuff like that. And then you see the wheels start to turn.
And animal herds are the same way, right? Like when food is plentiful, herds of deer or elk or coyotes, packs of coyotes, like the numbers go up in the good years, so that this is kind of hard to talk about, but in the lean years, when not as many animals can make it, it sets the herd up for long-term success. Right. So, even the animals are kind of doing the same thing.
Yeah. I was pointing out to some friends of mine this past weekend, we knew we had bad weather coming in, and I have a couple bird feeders in my backyard, that my yard was covered with birds. And it's almost like they knew.
They were getting ready.
I had probably about 3 dozen birds in my backyard. It's not a big backyard. And probably 8 different species that I can identify. Okay. And big bird, small bird, red
Right.
bird, I don't know. But they were out there and they were clearing out my feeders because I'm like, I know they know that tomorrow the weather's going to be terrible.
Yeah.
And they're going to be hunkered down deep into some tree against some tree trunks. Right. And that's what happened. And then the next day, the weather got a little better. They were out again.
Back out, yeah.
Because now they're like, well, we ate a lot and we hunkered down, but now I'm hungry again. Let's go
Right.
back out there. And it's just a matter of just watching the animals. And you
Yes.
could pick up so much
Absolutely.
about that. And I trust me, I'm not a botanist.
Right.
I'm not an animal
Me either.
biologist.
Right.
I mean, I just keep an eye on things
Right.
and watch it. And it's
Well,
you
like,
pick
do you
up on
remember
it.
that? I don't remember the specifics of this, but they're like those. They call them now old wives' tales, but about like caterpillars and things
Yep.
that if they have certain color or they're more fuzzy or whatever, one year it tells you something about the winter. I do think that nature is in tune to that stuff because it has to be to keep it going.
Yeah, if they didn't adapt, they wouldn't survive. They would have been,
Exactly.
we would have been not without all those birds that were in my backyard.
Right.
I saw birds I hadn't seen before. Like, what is that bird? And they're going after my bird feeders. Like, they are eating because they know it's going to be terrible weather.
Tomorrow they can't.
Yeah, they're going to be out there.
Yep.
And I had a deer walking through my front yard. I was like, I don't know what he's after, but
Oh, don't get me started on the deer. My front,
your neighborhood's a whole lot more than that.
Man,
than
my
mine.
front yard is a cornucopia of things for deer to come eat, so I've almost given up.
To get to my yard, they've got to cross I-25 and Nevada Avenue to get over to my neighborhood.
Right.
Yours, they just come out of the Air Force Academy,
That's right.
I think,
Yeah.
and get there.
Well, welcome to the Meister Salad Bar.
Yeah, well, for my neighborhood, it's mostly small packs of raccoons, and my
Okay.
cameras
Well,
will catch them, and there'll be 6 or 7 raccoons,
yeah.
and they're fat.
Oh yeah, they can do damage as well. That's right.
Somebody in my neighborhood is making.
They're all just trying to survive.
Yeah, they are. It's pretty interesting. When we're talking about cold weather and warm weather, I'm thinking about, and you're from Arizona. I spent some time in Arizona every year. The weather in Arizona in the summer has gotten outrageously hot.
Oh yeah.
Am I correct in understanding that Arizona's always been known to be hot. I mean, it's in the desert, it's in that valley, it sucks in the hot weather. But even for as hot as Arizona traditionally is, this is off the charts.
Oh, this year was
hot.
wild.
This year, last year, the year before.
Right.
I mean, I have to leave there by the beginning of May because it's already hitting 100 degrees.
Yeah.
That's not normal for even there. Is that?
It's kind of the same thing that we talked about in Colorado Springs about winters getting warmer, right? I mean, their summer's getting warmer. It's getting there earlier. The magnitude of the hottest time is higher. It's lasting longer. It doesn't cool off later. I mean, the Western U.S. has kind of really all sort of experienced that together for the most part. So, over the next 4 decades, do they get a little bit of improvement? We'll see as that Pacific Decadal Oscillation changes. But there's more concrete on the valley floor than there used to be. And concrete holds heat longer at night than a desert floor does. Yeah. So if you are, if sunlight is being transferred, shortwave energy is being transferred to longwave energy as that hits the buildings and the streets and the sidewalks, and it doesn't cool down at night as much because you're putting that energy back into the atmosphere, your next morning is starting off warmer than it would have if it was a desert floor. Right. That makes the next day, it all kind of rolls in together if you follow what I'm saying. Yeah. So it's all, nothing's in a vacuum, and it all is related. Everything we do is related and impacts the climate and all of that. So it's complicated. Right. And if you think about our ability to measure the atmosphere over the last 50 years has changed astronomically. Like, we just have better data now than we used to. And so, is that a function of some of this stuff? But certainly more thermometers when you're just measuring air temperature over concrete in urban areas than there used to be. Because we have more of that than 100 years ago.
And more accurate thermometers.
Right,
You're measuring the 10th or 100th of a degree instead of a degree.
Right, exactly.
I know that when it's interesting when I'm out in the desert, especially like late fall, I'm going to be down there in a couple of weeks, and early winter, and then in early spring, how cold the desert gets the minute the sun goes down. Mm-hmm. And I'm explaining to people, I'm in the desert and it's April and I'm wearing a sweatshirt because I'm freezing my tail off in the desert, where a couple hours ago, I was hiking in shorts and a T-shirt and sweating to death, and it's amazing.
It's the magic of dry air.
Oh, it just bam! It's like the sun goes behind a mountain, and it's like a switch gets flipped, and somebody turned the air conditioning on, and it gets cold in a hurry.
But on Mill Avenue in Tempe, they're not experiencing
that
at all because they've got all that concrete around them. So it all depends.
Yeah, it's pretty wild how it just happens. And I try to. People are like, why are you coming back in May? It's still cold there. It's 100 degrees in Phoenix.
Right, I gotta get out of there.
My poor dog with 2 layers of heavy, thick fur cannot handle this anymore. Right. He's dying in this stuff. He's got to get out of there. Matt, the weather is always an interesting thing. It's always a topic. I don't think I start off one of my weekly newsletters without touching base on the weather, like, hey, winter's here, or summer's here, and I don't know how. We kind of joked about, like San Diego, the weather person in San Diego's got it easy. The guy in Honolulu's got it easy. It's like, it's going to be 82 degrees and sunny.
Right.
Talk to me next week. The weather might change. And here it's always different.
Oh, yeah.
And the weather forecasting business, the media business that you're in and all the TV stations in town, they've had some people who've been here a long time, like yourself.
Absolutely.
Mike Daniels recently retired. Brian Bledsoe recently retired. They've been here a long time. Brian's from Colorado, so he grew up here. Mm-hmm. When you bring in a new meteorologist, do you find? I mean, obviously they're trained, and they know the weather. They're not coming in here, out of You wouldn't want me doing this, forecasting the weather. It'd be a disaster. But do you find that there's a pretty good learning curve for them to understand our particular weather here?
Yes.
Does it take? Because
some things are backwards than what the textbooks are, or the rules of thumb in other places. Here's an example. If you're in Iowa, right? As a cold front is approaching from the west, or which is attached to a storm, the pressure will be dropping, and the weather will be getting nasty. As soon as the cold front goes through, the pressure starts going up, and the weather's getting better. Here, it's exactly the opposite.
Really?
When our pressure is dropping here along the front range, most of the time air is sinking down the eastern slopes of the Rockies, and it's pretty nice. Here, once the cold front goes through and high pressure starts building in, we're usually getting upslope, and the weather's getting, less ideal, let's say. That's 180 degrees from whatever you learned in meteorology school, and it's just backwards here because of the mountains. And so there is a learning curve, and I don't think anyone ever has it figured out. And I'll tell you this, the time that you convince yourself, like, oh, I got this one nailed, that's when that curveball in the dirt comes, and you end up with egg on your face the next day.
That goes back to being half the time and being pretty good at it.
Thank you, Bob.
I like to, and I'm kidding, of course.
Thanks for keeping me humble.
I'm kidding. Obviously,
right. But I've learned over the years, man. Like you, well, we do honestly, but you have to have self-deprecating humor. Has served me well in this role. Because, it's the nature of the beast. Right. We aren't always going to get it right. One of the things I really try hard to do, and I think, I think why viewers have come to me over the years, is I try to communicate that uncertainty in the forecast because I think it's really important. Like, here's what I think is most likely to happen. This is also a realistic possibility. Here's why that's a possibility. And so at least be prepared for that. Right. Because if you walk out your door tomorrow and it isn't what I said, it's going to be this. And so at least that that's a possibility. And, some people don't do that either because they aren't given time in their newscast to do it. Haven't been here as long as I am. And so, I know to be humble. Right. And I, like I said, I know we don't know anything. And I work at a place where they give me that time to do that. Right. So I'm blessed in that way. And sometimes, communicating the uncertainty is actually the best piece of information that I've got, right? Like the rest of this week is an example. The storm's just going to sit somewhere over Arizona, we think, for like 30 hours. Right. And we know that the math and the models, like, we don't forecast that drifting very well. Right. So we don't there's not a big storm upstream to push this one along. And the closer it is, the bigger impact we'll have. Thursday as an example of some snow. Right. And we just don't know.
It's going to sit there, and it may move a little bit this way. It may move a little bit that way. It may move out earlier. Well, none of this is in your control. Right. And I give you a hard time about 50% of the time. You're obviously right. You're correct more often than that. When I look at a weather forecast, and you go to the Weather Channel, and you look at the daily, the hourly, and then you look at the 10-day. Yeah. Am I correct in thinking anything more than 3 days out? It's good to know, but I'm not gonna go to a casino and lay money on the 6 day out.
Yeah, I mean,
forecast.
We are pretty good from 72 hours in now, which is 3 days. And depending on the pattern, I mean, there are times where we are more confident in the pattern versus other times. Even, if you get 10 days out, which is what we do here on Fox 21, you can say, okay, there's something out there that is going to be a strong one. We just have to figure out the timing a little bit and the path. That's still helpful, right? If you have some big event coming up, or if you're, if you have a heater that needs to get fixed, you can say, oh, well, we better get that taken care of versus push it off a little bit. But of course, the farther you go out into the future from 0 hour, the more variables play into the forecast and the less accurate we are going to be. There is no doubt about that. That's part of the science. We're okay with it. But we know, again, we can catch some of those bigger things better now than we used to do 20, 40 years ago, for sure.
Sure. Yeah, in the summer when you could, if there's no storms coming, you could pretty much say, well, we're going to have sunny and pretty warm weather for the next 10 days. When the afternoon storm is going to hit, well, it's a crapshoot. Right. You're going to know that day when it hits. Right. Well, here's the time it's going to hit, Yeah. I use an app for my photography that helps me determine when is going to be a great sunrise or sunset to photograph. Okay. And what they're looking at is cloud cover, because that's what you want. Sure. You want some clouds. And they're looking at cloud cover 100 miles. What's the cloud cover literally 100 miles from where you're at? Because that actually what determines what it's going to look like overhead for you.
Most places, right? Yeah. And most of the time, like certainly if there's more moisture upstream. Right. But we get these weird situations where sometimes that app isn't going to catch where the clouds are kind of forming right above us because they're being lifted by the mountains, and you get those wave clouds, and they weren't there until that air hit the mountains. Yeah. So again, we're in a weird spot where what normally happens with weather doesn't always work out here. But there are apps for everything now.
There is.
Right? Even specific hobbies related to weather. It's fascinating to me, but it's great because weather does impact everybody. That's the only, I tell our news people, what I do is the only thing that we have in a newscast that affects every person watching, right? Some people, whatever the headline of the day is or the main story of the day, the top story, some people aren't going to care. Some people will. And every news story is like that. But everybody is impacted by the weather in some way or another.
The app I have for photography only goes out 3 days. And it's color coded, so it has a sunrise and sunset for each day. So a white day is bland. Probably overcast, just completely socked in. Blue days are okay, and as it goes up, and a red day is like, that's a phenomenal day. That's a day, get up early, stay out late, get the picture. But as I track that and I look at it 3 days out and go, oh, sunset on Wednesday, for example, looks good. And now I'm looking at it on Monday. And then Tuesday I look at it, and now it went from red to maybe orange. Okay. And then Wednesday shows up, and it's gone from red to, maybe a green, which is okay. Okay. And it's just like, but that's, and I look at that, and that tells me all I need to know about how the weather's changing so quickly. Right. Because now we're changing not only the cloud cover overhead, but what it is 100 miles away, because believe it or not, when you're looking at those beautiful sunsets, that's actually light from 100 miles away.
Very far away. You're right.
And so I'm looking at that, and it's just, when I started using that app a couple of years ago and started really paying attention to how it changed, it really drove into me how fast things change. And then even some days I go out there and it's like a green day, a light green day, which is, it's an iffy day, and you go out and you catch some of the best sunsets because something moved in at the last minute. Sure. So that's when it comes down to kind of like with your job, you've had a lot of experience. You kind of you have a gut feeling about what's going to happen
Right.
because you've been here a long time.
Right.
I've been doing this long enough. I go, I know what it's saying, but I'm looking at that sky and I think it's going to be better
Right.
than it is.
Right.
Or I look at it, it says red, and I'm looking up there going, not a chance. There's not a cloud in the
Right.
sky, not a chance it's going to be that good. And they'll tell you that, they're guessing.
Sure, well, of course.
Everybody's
It's
just
all-
guessing, and they're using educated guesses.
Sure.
Actually, I think there's some meteorology trained people who do make that app, and photographers have been around a long time, and they
Yeah.
use all these apps. But it's just another example of how, the weather affects everybody.
Yep.
It certainly affects what I do. Those big, beautiful sunsets don't come around when the sky is plain blue. You need a little bit of clouds
Right,
in there.
absolutely.
And where's that sun? It's 100 miles away. That's
Yeah.
actually the sun I'm looking at.
Right.
It's a sun
Isn't
that's
that
100 miles
fascinating?
away.
Yeah. It's crazy how far you can see. I think people don't really have that perspective. Like sometimes when you're looking east from Colorado Springs and you see the tops of thunderstorms, sometimes those things are 50 and 75 miles into Kansas.
Yeah.
They're, way out there.
Especially them big tornado producing.
Yeah,
ones out
right.
there.
It's wild how far you can see, or what looks like, maybe that's just east of Fountain. It's actually sitting over Springfield in the southeast corner of the state.
Right.
It's really, really deceiving how far you can look toward the horizon.
When I first visited here in the late 80s and was in awe of how, wide open everything was before I moved here, and I would watch the weather, and they would say the visibility in Colorado Springs is 100 miles. They don't say that anymore.
Right,
They say 10 miles.
Right.
But it was 100 miles.
It was,
and I didn't realize that. I'm
absolutely.
like,
Yeah.
oh, come on, I grew up where there's trees all over the place. You couldn't see a mile in any direction, but you come out here, and I'm looking, I go, well, yeah, I guess maybe it is 100 miles.
Right. Well, think of that, on Monarch Pass, like you can go up to the top and there's that observation tower there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can see 5 states
Right.
from that. And that's no joke. Pikes Peak is the same way.
Right.
I mean, on the right day, if, there's not smoke in the atmosphere or enough moisture where it kind of makes it hazy, you literally can see forever.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Matt, always a pleasure having you on here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure watching you. For folks, if you want to watch the weather, you want to watch the weather with a guy who's been here a while and knows it like the back of his hand, and will still make the best educated guess he can.
Hey, I've still shoveled 8 inches of partly cloudy off my driveway.
I give you a hard time, but I love you. Matt Meister, Fox21News.com, and the whole team. Your team does a great job.
Yeah, thank you. We work closely as a team. I mean, we're sharing information. We leave notes from shift to shift.
Yeah.
And so when we are making tweaks, there's a reason if there's a flip-flop from shift to shift, there's a meteorological reason for it.
Right.
And yeah, Robert and Megan and Ryan are great, and we all work really hard to do the best job we can to serve Southern Colorado.
Absolutely. And if you don't have it yet, the Fox 21 weather app, what I really like is those little 30-second or so videos that you put on there, and I know Robert does them, and then on the weekend they're up there.
Yeah.
So in the morning and evening, hey, here's what's coming for the next
Yep.
couple of days, and you get to go on a little longer than maybe you can on the morning news
Right.
and stuff like
Right.
that. So they're really handy, and I try to grab those every time they pop up.
Well,
there.
and we try to, like today's a good example. I did some really kind of small scale things for the snow coming in tonight and tomorrow morning. So it's not this, broad brush that we have to do necessarily for 40% of the state on TV.
Right.
You can start to focus into some of those smaller scale or even micro scale areas. And in particular in the summertime, if there's a storm, I mean, we'll push an alert on the app to people in the path of the storm.
Right.
So it allows us to kind of give you a digital door knock if you have that follow me feature turned on. And so if it's something that affects you, we're like, hey, Bob, you need to know this. So you're not getting something for Pueblo if you're on the north side of the Springs and vice versa.
Or Callahan or something like
right,
that. Yeah,
exactly.
Excellent. Well, Matt, thanks again for being on the podcast.
My pleasure.
Always a pleasure. I know we run into each other off and on during the course of the year when I'm in here doing something else
Sure.
and recording this in the beautiful Fox 21 studios. If you haven't seen this place, it's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Big
Well, keep up the good work,
big
my man.
screens all over the
You make
place.
our community better. So
thanks
thanks for what you do.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And everybody, thank you for listening to the Outdoors Hiking Bob podcast. We'll talk to you next time.